Hello, hi guys, and a very warm welcome to or back to my channel, and a big thank you for tuning in. Once again, I will be covering another true crime case, of course, and if that is the type of content that you are interested in, please do subscribe to stick around for more. So the case that I'll be covering today is a bit like the Kendrick Jenkins case that I covered previously. I don't know whether to call the case solved or unsolved. As you can tell by the title, the case that I'll be covering today is the Kendrick Johnson case, which took place in Valdosta, Georgia in 2013. This case was actually recommended to me by one of my subscribers, so although I personally wasn't aware of this case previously, it is a very popular case and there's an array of sources online concerning this case, much like the Kendrick Jenkins case. With both cases, there are believed to be some sort of ill motive or wider cover-up, and despite the police and investigators' official findings, the Johnson family and the community do believe that there are some untold truths, and you guys will understand why. This case is so suspicious, like there's a lot to digest, so you guys might want to get comfortable and sit down to take this one in. Let's get into what I do know. So Kendrick Johnson was a 17-year-old high school student who grew up in Valdosta in southern Georgia in the USA and attended Lowndes High School. Kendrick was born to his parents Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, and they both described him as this like really sweet, calm, quiet, well-mannered young man, and Jackie literally described him as the joy of their family. Kendrick was known to just sort of keep himself to himself and just sort of stay within his own friendship group, but he was considered friendly and approachable by his peers. He was a very calm person, but with his friends and family he was always said to be the jokester, always making everyone laugh and lifting everyone's spirits. So it does make it all the more upsetting to learn what eventually happens to Kendrick. Kendrick was also a three-sport athlete, which is impressive in itself, like playing three sports and actually being good at all of them. So you can imagine that Kendrick was very athletic and incredibly interested in sport. But out of all the sports he played, Kendrick particularly loved American football. He had endeavoured to play it professionally later on in life after he graduated, and he had hoped to play for the Gators. His mum Jackie said that Kendrick would always come to her and say, "You guys ain't gonna have to worry about working no more, I'm gonna take care of you." But Kendrick would unfortunately never have the chance. In the cases that I cover, I consciously try to portray a vivid account of what took place leading up to the incident, but the 10th of January 2013 was quite an unremarkable, mundane day for Kendrick. It was the second day back to school after the Christmas holiday, and Kendrick had plans to watch a basketball match after school, but other than that it was just a typical school day, socialising with friends, playing sports and going to class. But peculiarities began to occur as the day went by. First one being that Kendrick was marked absent for his class after lunch, and he had attended his morning classes. But I guess it's not that unusual for a teenage boy to bunk off his lessons, so it didn't really concern the school that much. But when Kendrick didn't return home by the time he usually would, that was enough to concern his parents. As I did say, Kendrick was planning on watching a basketball match after school that evening, but when he didn't return home by 10 p.m, his mum Jackie drives around the school and the surrounding areas to see if he's just like chilling or gallivanting with his friends, and that's why he hadn't come home, but he hadn't even attended the basketball match. Jackie spent the night hoping that Kendrick was okay and that he'd return in the early hours of the morning, but of course he didn't. So Jackie drove to Kendrick's school. Perhaps he had just gone straight to school from wherever he was and he didn't have time to stop off at home. But we all know that that wasn't the case.
911, where's your emergency?
Yes, I'm calling. My son didn't come home from school today and he still haven't got here.
Okay, what's your son's name?
Kendrick Johnson.
Jackie found that Kendrick had been marked absent again for his morning class. So with the help of the school, Jackie begins printing out missing persons posters in search for Kendrick. Meanwhile, in the school's old gymnasium, there's a lesson being held called Live Sports that's held by a sports coach called Coach Philip. I won't say his full name just because when I was researching him I found so much personal information about him, like, not to sound like a creep, but I found his address, his phone number, his LinkedIn, like, yeah. And that was with very little effort, so yeah, I hope those details aren't up to date. But I digress. So it's approaching the end of Coach Philip's lesson and there's just like lots of students mucking about, and one girl in particular is playing about on like some wrestling match that are like sort of stacked up. We don't have that in the UK, but well, my school didn't have that, but I can only imagine it's like PE mats. They're a lot bigger than PE mats, but they're like the same sort of shape as a PE mat, so that sort of idea. So she's playing on these wrestling mats that are sort of stacked up. As you can imagine, she's on top of these wrestling mats and she's sort of like elevated. So she becomes alarmed when she notices socks sticking out of a rolled up wrestling mat that's standing vertically against the wall. Upon further inspection, this girl notices that these aren't just socks, these are someone's feet, and this person appears to be upside down. She also notices a potent smell of vomit and blood, so she immediately alerts Coach Philip, and he tries to pull this person out by their feet from the top of the mat. So he's pulling this person out by their feet from the top of the mat, but the mat's still at 6 feet tall, so he quickly realises that he's going to be unsuccessful in getting them out that way. So he lays the mat on the floor and unravels the mat. In doing so, he exposed the deceased, decomposing body of Kendrick Johnson. Kendrick was found in a white t-shirt, blue jeans and white socks with no shoes on. The condition that Kendrick was found in was absolutely horrifying. Like, he was literally unrecognisable. Like, his head had swollen because he had been upside down for a prolonged period of time, and all the blood had rushed to his head. His skin had blackened. Like, at the sight of him, anyone would have assumed that he had been tortured. Like, his face particularly was in such a bad way that literally anyone would think that his face had been battered. I won't be using pictures of his face when he was found, just because I feel like to post him in such condition is just distasteful. But his family has used these pictures throughout the case for like protests and rallies, so if you do want to look up these photos, by all means, they are all over the internet, but do approach with caution. So Coach Philip demands all of the students to get out of the gymnasium. Like, witnessing something like that must be so traumatic, so I can imagine that he didn't want them to see Kendrick's body. Coach Philip himself would have never dealt with such findings, so he really didn't know what to do either. It was even another student who first thought to call the police.
Come to Lowndes High School now. There's a dead body out here.
Okay, where at, sir?
Lowndes High School in the old gym.
When the school learned that the dead body of Kendrick Johnson was found wrapped up in a wrestling mat in the school gymnasium, the school went into an immediate lockdown. One of Kendrick's best friends, Ricky, recalled learning about Kendrick's death when a student burst into his class crying profusely because a dead body had been found in their school gym. He said he remembers everyone's phones violently pinging constantly. He then sees Kendrick's mum crying because she had learned of Kendrick's death in the same way, unofficially through hearsay during the school's lockdown. And this confirmed for him that his friend was indeed dead. Kendrick's dad, Kenneth, was actually not in town at the time. He had been picking up this 18-wheeler truck that he was so excited to show Kendrick. So Jackie had to inform him herself, and he came rushing home. Now that Kendrick's body was found, it was up to authorities to work out what had transpired which resulted in Kendrick's death. So the police and investigators arrive at the school and take witness statements from the students and Coach Philip and look for any evidence. But because Kendrick's body had seemingly been in the mat for such a long time and gone unnoticed, the crime scene would have been contaminated. Like, there would have been footprints everywhere, fingerprints everywhere. The authorities didn't even like tape off the area as a crime scene, nor did they wear like the appropriate foot covering. So any potential evidence would have been disturbed at that point. I mean, a whole lesson took place in the gym with a dead body in there. But the police and investigators did retrieve some information. So when Kendrick's body was found by Coach Philip, before he had unravelled the mat, he was found with his arms by his side. So he was sort of head first in the mat. Not like in a position where you like dive in. He was sort of like head first, arms by his side, upside down. There were 2 pairs of trainers or sneakers found with him in the mat, but they were kind of like separated. One trainer was found like directly under Kendrick's head, so he was basically on top of the trainer. Like, let's say this is the trainer, this is Kendrick's head, and the pair to that trainer was found outside of the mat, whilst the second pair of trainers were found tightly snugged behind Kendrick's legs. The police also found blood on a nearby wall, which they had tested, and it was confirmed that that wasn't Kendrick's blood, but they didn't investigate further to like find out whose blood it actually was. And I think that could have been useful. Like, the blood splatter could have indicated something, indicated a struggle, or like pointed to potential suspects. I don't know. They also found Kendrick's schoolbook on the floor, which was taken in for evidence too. However, when it came to contacting the coroner, which is the person appointed to determine the cause of death for like unnatural deaths or murders, there was a major delay, a 6-hour delay, even though it was very obvious by that point that Kendrick was dead.
The only reason that I was questioning this incident whatsoever was I wasn't called to the scene in a timely fashion.
And given that Kendrick's body had been upside down for a prolonged period of time without being noticed, you'd imagine that this situation was quite time sensitive, and the coroner would be in a better position to identify his cause of death in the earlier stages of decomposition. But I'm not too sure why they took so long contacting the coroner. Sketchy. But when the coroner was called, Kendrick's body was sent away for an autopsy. 24 hours later, so very soon after, the results of Kendrick's autopsy were in, and the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office preliminary investigation determined that Kendrick's death was as a result of asphyxia, and they deemed it accidental.
The investigation determined Kendrick accidentally smothered to death.
We examined all the alternatives that were presented to us, and the only one that fit the physical evidence and the forensic evidence and the testimonial evidence that we received was this is an accident.
They hypothesized that Kendrick was looking for his trainer, fell into the hole of the wrestling mat, got stuck upside down and suffocated to death. They suggested that because Kendrick was upside down, all of his blood would have rushed to his head, and because he was in a confined space, his body wouldn't have received enough oxygen and he would have suffocated. Students at the school had told authorities that it wasn't unusual for students to throw their trainers into the hole of the wrestling mat and then collect it after, just so they didn't have to pay for lockers. But as you can imagine, Kendrick's parents, Jackie and Kenneth, were not having any of it. They just were completely unsatisfied by this theory. They just thought it was ridiculous, really. Like, the theory just wasn't airtight and it raised so many questions. 1. If Kendrick had willingly jumped into the mat or even fallen in, wouldn't his arms instinctively be in front of him to either retrieve his trainer or guard his fall? 2. If Kendrick's trainer was inside the mat, wouldn't the easier option be to lift the mat and retrieve his trainer from underneath the mat, as opposed to going inside the mat and struggling to get back out? 3. A point I personally find very strange. Kendrick's shoulders were 19 inches in width, whilst the diameter in the hole was 14.5 inches. If Kendrick jumped in or even fell in, he wouldn't be able to fit in because the width of his shoulders exceeded the diameter of the hole. When Kendrick was found, most of his body was in the mat and it was just his feet sticking out of the mat, which would suggest that his body sort of glided into the mat with no friction, despite the disproportion in measurement. Like, I suppose the mat would have been made out of some sort of malleable material, but that wouldn't give way for a whole human body to enter with ease. Like, how can you fall into an opening that's smaller than you? Like, something doesn't make sense. Like, the maths isn't mathing. 4. If he was actually stuck in the mat, wouldn't he be like shouting, trying to get someone's attention to help him get out of the mat? Like, I'm sure a school full of 3,000 students, he would have caught someone's attention. 5. The trainers behind Kendrick's legs, how did they get there? They could have only been put there after Kendrick had already fallen into the mat, so someone put them there, no? Also, how did the pairing for the trainer underneath Kendrick's head end up outside of the mat? If Kendrick was stuck in the mat, he wouldn't have been able to throw it out himself. Finally, 6. These wrestling mats were bound by a strap, so if Kendrick jumped in or went in looking for his trainer, it would have been physically impossible for him to get back out without someone helping him get back out, so he wouldn't have went in the first place. The circumstances in which Kendrick's body was found just didn't make sense, and that wasn't the only thing that didn't make sense. During the police investigation, they reviewed the school's security footage, and strangely there was a substantial amount of missing footage. Part of the footage showed Kendrick walking into the gymnasium at around 1:09 p.m. in the direction of the wrestling mats. And then he walks out of shot of the functioning camera. He walks past a student that he's seemingly unfamiliar with, as he doesn't interact with this student. This student also appears to be walking in the opposite direction. A group of students then walk into the gym 3 minutes after Kendrick and then walk out immediately after. They appear to be engaged in casual conversation and appear to be quite unfazed. In the footage, the group didn't appear to have witnessed anything out of the ordinary, despite walking into the gym just 3 minutes after Kendrick. They just look like they're having like a friendly chat amongst themselves. But that was the last time Kendrick is caught on camera, and he's never actually seen leaving the gymnasium. Now, 3 minutes is too short a period for Kendrick to try and get his shoe, fall into the mat and die, and conveniently conceal his body where no one would see him, despite a group of students walking in 3 minutes after he entered the gym. If Kendrick had just fallen into the mat as these students walked in, then you can imagine that there would have been some sort of struggle, or they would have heard him shouting and probably went to his aid, but they walked in and walked out as if they've seen nothing. They were just engaged in casual conversation. Also, it's not possible that the group of students that walks into the gym 3 minutes after Kendrick are responsible for his death, just because the surveillance footage catches them walking in and then walking out almost immediately after. It's why the missing security footage is particularly suspicious, because it would have revealed what happened after Kendrick walked into the gymnasium and why he would never walk out alive. So CNN voluntarily hired a professional video surveillance team to review the Lowndes High School security footage from January the 10th when Kendrick went missing to January the 11th when Kendrick's body was found. The cameras were light and motion censored, so they all began recording in the early hours of the morning as daylight rose. But for unexplained reasons, the first camera stops recording at 12:04 p.m. and starts recording again at 1:09 p.m. The second camera stops recording at 11:05 a.m. and begins recording again at 1:15 p.m. The third camera stops recording at 11:05 a.m. and starts recording again at 1:16 p.m. The fourth camera stops recording at 12:04 p.m. and starts recording again at 1:09 p.m. The private surveillance team concluded that these files were not the original surveillance footage files and they had been doctored in some sort of way. They found that every camera had footage missing and that some of the files were corrupt and could not be played back. So they determined that all of these files had been altered in some way. This meant that the footage only showed Kendrick walking into the gym and all of the cameras pointed in the direction of the mats were out of action following Kendrick's entry. There are also various periods throughout the day after 1:16 p.m. that are unaccounted for where the cameras are just out of action. Kendrick's family took matters into their own hands. This was their son that had been taken from them, so getting justice for his death and uncovering what had actually happened to him would probably be the most important things they felt they ever had to do in their lives.
Now I have an answer. I will fight like hell.
Johnsons felt that authorities were apathetic towards Kendrick's death, and even if he was nothing to them, Kendrick was everything to Kenneth and Jackie. By this point in the investigation, Kendrick had been buried and laid to rest, but his family made the decision to exhume his body and carry out an independent autopsy.
Next to her son Kendrick's grave. The first time he was being lowered into the ground. This time he's being pulled out of it.
Did you ever expect you'd have to exhume his body?
No, I didn't expect to have to bury his body.
I can imagine that this decision wasn't made lightly. Ideally, the Johnsons wouldn't have wanted to disturb Kendrick in his place of rest. They felt that the way that the authorities conducted their investigation was far too questionable. Things didn't add up, not enough things were meticulously looked into, and their theory was just flawed. They felt that an independent autopsy could potentially uncover some hidden truths that were perhaps intentionally kept hidden. Ultimately, they felt that this independent autopsy could be instrumental in getting justice for Kendrick. This independent autopsy was conducted by Dr. William R. Anderson with Forensics Dimension, and they concluded that Kendrick's cause of death was by no means accidental. Dr. Anderson deemed Kendrick's death a result of blunt force trauma to the right side of his neck, which was observable in the damage to the soft tissue near Kendrick's main artery. This injury was not consistent with suffocation or positional asphyxiation as the initial autopsy had determined. This independent autopsy suggested that Kendrick had been murdered. And this autopsy satisfied the Johnsons' family's theory. They believe that Kendrick was attacked and murdered by a person or group of people in the school who forcibly put him in the wrestling mat to hide his body. They also believe that there was some sort of racial motive behind the attack, and the authorities are involved in covering it up.
What do I think happened to Kendrick? I think Kendrick was lured into the gym by a white girl, and there he was attacked, and then he was hit by a weight to take him down, and there they finished beating him up.
And I'm obviously not American, nor do I live in America, but you do hear that historically southern parts of America are known to be extremely racist towards black people. And these assumptions aren't unreasonable because the oddities in this case just do not seem to end. When Kendrick's body was exhumed, the pathologist Dr. Anderson found that every single organ in Kendrick's body had been removed. So his brain, heart, lung, liver, etc. had all been replaced by scrunched up newspaper.
The place of the organs?
Newspaper.
Newspaper.
Dr. Anderson showed me the pictures of Kendrick's body he'd taken during the second autopsy.
It's a Black Friday ad, JCPenney ad. Yes.
Needless to say, the family had not been made aware. This raised even more suspicion within the community, particularly the black community. They thought maybe Kendrick had been victim of organ harvesting. They thought maybe the disposal of his organs was part of a wider cover-up. So the Johnsons approached the funeral home and asked them what the hell did they do with their son's organs. And the funeral home say yes, they were responsible for stuffing Kendrick's body with newspaper. However, they had not received Kendrick's body with his organs in it from the coroner. The Johnsons then approach the coroner and ask, oh, what the hell did they do with their son's organs? And the coroner says that Kendrick's organs had decomposed and deteriorated so badly that they couldn't preserve them. So they basically threw his organs away. I don't know about that one. I guess Kendrick's body had been upside down for 21 hours, so I guess that would have affected the rate at which his body was decomposing. But was it bad enough that they needed to discard his organs? I don't know. Also, apparently stuffing his body with newspaper was not a completely uncommon practice. It wasn't the preferred way for a mortician to fill a dead body, but it was the cheaper alternative as opposed to more acceptable material like cotton. The Johnson family said that they found this to be extremely disrespectful and they did not appreciate it at all.
Stuffing that newspaper in like he was a garbage can inside his body. It's unbelievable.
However, although the funeral home were being cheap, basically, they're in no violation of any law, so no legal action was taken against them. But the Johnson family felt that the same couldn't be said for the high school that Kendrick attended and other authorities. The independent autopsy was just the inception in their journey for getting justice for Kendrick. They were not going to stop there. They were going to hold everybody that they felt to be involved in Kendrick's death accountable for the parts that they played. They started by filing a wrongful death suit against the Lowndes County Board of Education and the principal of Lowndes High School. The surveillance cameras were not able to ensure safety for the students of the school. These cameras are not just decorative features in the school. Parents should feel confident that their children are in a secure environment. So the cameras not capturing the moments that follows Kendrick's entry into the gym just was not going to cut it. Jackie had also reported a particular student to the school, a student that Kendrick had informed her of that was constantly picking on him and bullying him. Jackie told the school that this student was constantly harassing her son and he needed to be reprimanded. But the school took no action. This student was Brandon Bell. Jackie also mentioned him and his brother Brian Bell in the lawsuit. The school were made aware of a situation that could have potentially escalated because they had did nothing to stop it. Brandon was the older brother and he was on the school wrestling team, and Brian was the younger brother and he was Kendrick's classmate. And both brothers unofficially became persons of interest due to the history of Brandon and Kendrick's relationship. In 2014, a popular magazine called Ebony Magazine caught wind of the contents of the lawsuit. They reported in a magazine article that there were now 2 potential suspects in the Kendrick Johnson case, Brandon and Brian Bell. The magazine could not and did not mention the boys' names, but they did describe them in extensive detail and it was pretty obvious who they were talking about. Ebony Magazine did some digging and their findings were quite concerning. As I mentioned before, Brandon was on the school wrestling team and Kendrick was found in a wrestling mat. But what was more concerning was that Brandon and Brian's dad worked for the FBI. And this just further reinforced the presumption that there was a wider cover-up at play. The article detailed the history of Kendrick's relationship with the brothers and alluded to the brothers being responsible for Kendrick's murder. They also highlighted that if the brothers were responsible for Kendrick's murder, they had connections with an authoritative person of power who could make things go away. And because of the magnitude of power that some people in society possess, like these acts of corruption usually never come to light. But it is important to know that these things do happen. Like that to me is just so scary. But that's not to say that the boys were responsible for Kendrick's death, but it is noteworthy that their father worked for the FBI. All of these contributing factors just seemed far too sketchy for the Johnson family, so they end up filing an $100 million lawsuit against Randy Bell, the boy's father, suggesting that he ordered his 2 sons to murder Kendrick. To be honest, that claim does seem pretty unfounded. I'm not too sure why or how they came to that conclusion, but I can only put it down to the desperation in wanting to get justice for Kendrick, and I guess you could sympathise and empathise with that. Nonetheless, they did drop this lawsuit as there was no evidence to validate their claim. However, the Bell brothers were still looked into by the police and by the community. They spoke with reporters and they spoke with police, and they both maintained that they had nothing to do with Kendrick's death.
I'm going to ask my photographer to push in tight on your face.
Okay.
Our viewers can read your expression. Did you have anything to do with the death of Kendrick Johnson?
No. He was like one of my good friends.
Even at the time of his death?
even at the time of his death.
You know, every word we broadcast of this is going to be scrutinized by the blogosphere, the Twitter sphere, and so on.
Yes, sir. It should be. And I want everybody to know the truth. And I mean, they can ridicule me and they can say whatever they want, but in the end, the truth will prevail. And everybody will find that me and my brother have been innocent and always will be innocent.
Brian Bell, who was in the same year or grade as Kendrick, says that there was no malice between them and they were even friends. And of course, Jackie Johnson refutes this. She says that that's just a lie, like Brian was not Kendrick's friend. But even if Brian was lying, even if the brothers did have this unpleasant relationship with Kendrick, that did not confirm that they killed him. They were allowed to not be friends. So the police stopped looking into them as the boys were able to provide solid alibis. And after that, the boys just completely stopped cooperating with the investigation effort. They wanted nothing to do with it. They stopped speaking with reporters, stopped speaking with press. And I'm sure their dad had something to do with this, as I keep mentioning that he did work for the FBI. This could also be because the boys just wanted to completely absolve themselves of any involvement in the case, because they had experienced harassment as a result, because everyone did think that they were responsible. The boys' parents even went as far as filing a $5 million lawsuit against Ebony magazine for even insinuating that the boys were responsible for Kendrick's death, because as a result their sons were being bullied and harassed. Brandon Bell had even gotten a scholarship to play American football for Florida State University, but that scholarship was revoked because they didn't want to recruit a potential murderer. And if Brandon Bell actually isn't responsible for Kendrick's death, then I completely understand why he would want to detach himself from the case and just want nothing to do with it, because this ultimately affected the course of these boys' lives. The Johnson family, on the other hand, gains tremendous support from the community, and Reverend Rose of Valdosta Southern Leadership Conference supported them throughout the case. He assisted in conducting a private investigation alongside the official investigation. At a rally that was held for Kendrick, Jackie was actually arrested for civil disobedience, and Reverend Rose actually collateralized his home to bail her out, and that is just so commendable. They also had support from the famous black activist Al Sharpton, who held fundraising events for the family. So when it was time to go to court, the family and the community stood in solidarity.
What up, Young World? It's your favorite cousin, Young Jock. We need justice for Kendrick Johnson.
Why does the family think that there's something suspicious about this?
Because from day one, they were told that their son dove headfirst into a mat, suffocated, and died. I mean, just the blatant disrespect, the overt labeling of ignorance that they had on this family, to think that they were just gonna take that, and they ain't laid down since. You know, this is a family that, you know, every day of the week for years was at the steps of the courthouse and still continues to protest. It's a family that participated in civil disobedience. Seven members were arrested, including the parents. This is a family that travels the country helping out other families who have even gotten justice.
Because of the sketchy nature of Kendrick's death and the way the authorities dealt with it quite carelessly, the Department of Justice were looking into the case. In November 2015, the Department of Justice filed a motion to stay the Johnsons' case against the Lowndes County Board of Education and others. This basically means putting the trial on hold pending their own investigation. But this motion was denied. The Johnsons had hoped that perhaps the findings of the Department of Justice whilst their lawsuit was on hold would aid their lawsuit. But since the motion to stay the trial was denied, the Johnsons just dismissed their lawsuit altogether, with the hopes to refile once the Department of Justice had finished conducting their own investigation. But ultimately, this just did not work well in the Johnsons family's favour. It looked really bad on them. It just looked like they were wasting people's time and wasting people's money. As a result, they faced lawsuits from various attorney offices. Also, many of the defendants that they had filed lawsuits against actually filed defamation lawsuits against the Johnson family, as they felt that they had been falsely accused by the family. These people would have paid to have lawyers for the initial trial, and now that the Johnson family were dismissing the file, they were holding the family accountable for the attorney fees. Also, many of the defendants that the Johnson family had filed lawsuits against actually filed defamation lawsuits against the Johnson family, as they felt that the family had falsely accused them. Collectively, the family was sued for over $850,000 for attorney fees and $1 million for defamation damages. but a judge later ordered the family to pay $292,000 in attorney's fees to the people that they accused of misconduct. But after everything, to top it off, on the 20th of June 2016, the Department of Justice complete their investigation and decide that they're not filing any criminal charges, which was obviously the reason the Johnson family had dismissed their lawsuit in the first place, with the hopes that the Department of Justice would find something that would aid their lawsuit when refiled. So now the family are buried in legal fees and still feel that there's no justice for their son, and it is easy to lose sight of everything, but getting justice for Kendrick is the point of everything. But the authorities still insist that Kendrick's death was an accident, despite the outcome of the independent autopsy. So in 2018, the family felt that they had to make the awful, difficult decision to exhume Kendrick's body for the second time for a third autopsy. And they felt that if the outcome of the third autopsy was consistent with the second, then hopefully Kendrick's case would be reopened as a murder investigation. Sure enough, the outcome for the third autopsy was consistent with the second, and Kendrick's cause of death was deemed to be blunt force trauma to the side of his neck. But Kendrick's case was not reopened, and the Sheriff Department said there was not enough evidence to reopen the case as a murder case, and they insisted that Kendrick's death was some sort of accident.
Hey, Sheriff Prime. Hi. Victor Blackwell, CNN.
Chris Prime.
The Sheriff's Department has denied a cover-up, but we took the Johnsons' concerns to Lowndes County Sheriff Chris Prime. Got some questions about the Kendrick Johnson case.
I'm not going to discuss that with you.
Why not, sir?
Because our case is closed.
The family has some concerns about why some things were not taken into evidence. There was blood on the wall.
I'll discuss the case with you.
Reaching for the shoe, and the shoe is beneath him. Why isn't that shoe covered with blood?
And what do you think about that shoe not being covered with blood?
It was placed there.
Despite public rallies and petitions, the case was just not reopened. They just completely refused. And I feel like Chris Prine, the sheriff at the time, was just really unwilling to help or even entertain the idea that Kendrick had been murdered. CNN were really invested in this case, and they went to go speak with Chris Prine, and he just completely shut them down. Kendrick's family and the community did begin to lose faith in the justice system, but that didn't stop their fight for justice. They continued with their protests, their rallies and their petitions. However, more recently there is quite literally a new sheriff in town, and the Kendrick Johnson case has officially been reopened as of March 10th, 2021, which is just amazing news. And this new sheriff has promised to treat the case as a new case, and he's appointed some new investigators on the case along with some old ones. I think the case should be looked into with a complete fresh set of eyes, but despite everything, I do hope justice is served. Naturally, some people have been a bit apprehensive about the reopening of the case just because it has been 8 years since Kendrick has passed, and in that time frame evidence could have been destroyed, but I feel like we can only be hopeful that the truth will prevail. But yeah, that's all I've got for this case, and boy was it a dense one. First of all, one thing I felt whilst researching this case is tremendous respect for Kendrick's mum. I just feel like she just keeps going, she won't let anyone silence her, she just will keep fighting for her son. But I don't know what I make of the case itself. I don't get how he could have been murdered and no one notices anything like screaming or a struggle or even blood on the floor. These are secondary school students or high school students, not seasoned murderers. How do they carry out a murder in plain sight and then cover it up? But of course there is the theory that there were powerful people involved in this cover-up. But then I also refuse to accept the theory that he just fell into the mat. Just no. I feel like everyone involved was just weird, weird. Even Kendrick's friends said that they felt really rejected by the school and it was really hurtful, and only 3 teachers attended Kendrick's funeral and people in school would act funny around them. Guilty? Maybe. Personally, I suspect some sort of foul play, I can't lie, but what do you guys think? Do you think it was a prank gone wrong? Do you think it was an accident? Do you think he was murdered? I want to know you guys' thoughts on the case. But I do apologise if there's anything that I have missed out. I've just collectivised online information that I have access to, but if there's something you guys know that I don't know, please let us all know in the comment section below. But all in all, I really do hope that you guys did enjoy this video and you found it informative, and if you'd like to see more, please like, comment and subscribe. You can also engage with me on my socials where we can discuss these cases further, but for now, see you in my next video.